Hi, everyone. Welcome to your audience. When ISPA told me about this panel, I liked the title because I feel like it implies that we're going to try to meet audiences where they are and see who they are with kind of an openness and not like the build it and they will come, we hope, model. I'm Elena Park. In New York, I'm anchored at Lincoln Center at the Metropolitan Opera and National Sawdust. So I've seen both a big institution try to transform itself with changing times, as well as a new grassroots organization kind of start from nothing. Obviously, if we had had this panel pre-pandemic, we'd have a much different conversation. It's a completely different landscape. There are concerns about declining numbers, audience behavior, but there are a lot of encouraging signs and interesting approaches, and the more I've talked to the folks on this panel, the more I've been feeling optimistic. So we hoped that we can offer some practical tips as well as some philosophical ideas that might get to the points of re-envisioning our relationship with audiences and the way we think about them, thinking about engagement, loyalty, the idea of subscriptions and things like that in a different way. So with that said, each panelist will do a short presentation. We'll have a general discussion, and then we'll reserve the last 20, 30 minutes for questions. And I would love not to have to repeat your questions. So there are 2 standing mics on either side, the floor level and the first level, and a roving mic, but it seems to take longer to get the roving mic for obvious reasons. So if you think of questions along the way that you'd like to pose to the panel, just keep them in mind for the end. So we're going to start with Deeksha Gaur. She has experience in both commercial and nonprofit worlds. She has been for 5 months the head of TDF. We just had the prior, I think, executive director speaking. But she's also worked in nonprofit theater, places like Woolly Mammoth and Long Wharf. So I'll turn it over to Deeksha, and I will introduce everyone else in succession, including our translator.
Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. Hello, everyone. I'm Deeksha. I'm the new executive director at TDF. I've been there since August of this year. And for those of you who aren't familiar, TDF is a nonprofit service arts organization. And we're unique in this country in that we're the only nonprofit service arts organization that serves the audience. Our mission is to remove barriers to access for attendance. But more than that, we are thinking about, so you may know us by the iconic TKTS booth that is in the center of Times Square, where you can get half-price tickets. We have membership programs, et cetera. But when I think about TDF and breaking down barriers to access, it's not just the physical barriers or the price barriers. What we're really thinking about is, what are the invisible barriers to attendance? The things that we don't see, we don't get to experience, but are real and make audiences feel like they don't belong, that the space isn't for them. And so at TDF, as we dive into our work of planning our future, we are thinking a lot about invisible barriers to access, audience, and not only how do you bring audience to the theater, but how can art engage with audiences where they are? So I guess I can say a little bit more. So I don't think I need to spend a lot of time talking about the state of the field right now. We're all living it, we know it. They say the regional theater, for example, we're seeing 25% of audiences to 30% of audiences haven't returned. For Broadway, it's about 15%, so doing a little bit better. But the press right now is telling a story, and there are real challenges we're facing, and we're seeing a lot of coverage of that. But as Elena mentioned, there's so much great opportunity right now. This is a real moment to rethink. And one of the statistics, the Broadway League publishes a demographics report every year, and one of the statistics that just came out, one of the reports that just came out, said that this is the youngest audience that Broadway has seen in years. So pre-pandemic, the average age was 44. Last year, it was 40. This is also the most diverse audience that Broadway has ever seen. So we have an opportunity to work towards the audiences we want to see, engaging with the art that we're making. And that feels like a great opportunity. And having spoken to my fellow panelists, there's some really exciting ideas percolating. And so I will cede the floor.
Thanks, Deeksha. To the point of audiences being more diverse, Yuval, who I've been a long time fan of his work, I felt like Yuval's work has always brought in a very different audience for opera. I think of him as being a disruptor, a catalyst with the site-specific work that he's done, and also he was the first, I think, American to direct at Bayreuth, at the Bayreuth Festival, the home of Richard Wagner's work. So I was actually shocked when in 2020, Yuval decamped and went into the belly of the beast at Detroit Opera. Because first and foremost, you're a director, but now you're an artistic director. And one of the reasons I'm glad that he's with us today is because he thinks from both the generative, creative perspective and about audiences, what to program, who to showcase, how to bring them in. Not too much pressure, Yuval, Sharon.
Thank you, Elena. And hello, everybody. I'm so glad to be here in this beautiful space. It's so nice to see this theater. I really like what Deeksha had to say about barriers, because I think that about opera as having a major issue with perceived barriers of inclusion and perceived barriers. And some of those are not perceived. Some of them are actual barriers. But how do we encourage audiences to really take a chance on something that might feel really out of their reach, or that might not have anything to say to them, to a contemporary audience? So a little bit of background about me. I do consider myself first and foremost a stage director for opera, but when I didn't feel like the field had a place for the kind of work that I wanted to do, I moved to Los Angeles and started an organization called The Industry, and really became about site responsive and environmental and immersive work. It has now become a kind of small institution, to my great surprise, and maintaining that institution has been a fascinating journey for me. And as Elena said, in 2020, when the world was shutting down for COVID, I was asked to become the artistic director of Detroit Opera. And I have to say, if it wasn't for the pandemic, I would certainly have said no to this job. It was not where I saw my trajectory at all. I really wanted to stay focused on the art making. But I think that the opportunity that COVID gave us to rethink everything was a chance that I felt like I couldn't pass up. Because as much as I believe that change needs to start with the actual art, and I really still believe that that's true, that it needs to begin with the work that we're producing. To be a producer has another level of responsibility and also another level of possibility to make that transformation possible. If I'm visiting a theater and I'm doing one show, maybe that show will have an enormous impact. I don't really know because I leave and I go home. But to be invested in a community over time, to help shape what a community thinks art is about, is such a tremendous both opportunity and responsibility. And I felt like this is the moment for change in 2020. I still look back now on 2020 and think, yeah, that was the moment for change. And my personal challenge, I know we're going to be talking about it, is how to maintain that spirit of new horizons that we must be exploring. I have been feeling an encroaching sense that the empire is striking back, meaning all of the old ways that we did things are starting to feel like, oh, but wouldn't it be better if we could go back to our old favorite subscription model? Wouldn't that be just so wonderful? Because we know what that is and we can trust on what that is. And wouldn't it be great to do a good old-fashioned production again that's just mindless and takes our worries off of everything? So, you know, that wasn't the mindset in 2020, and that was when I was really excited about this change. So I'm trying to hold on to that and trying to make sure that we are still really keeping. We made some great strides in the wake of 2020 and coming back to the theater. We just need to keep pushing, is my general feeling.
Well, that cues up Jason Kovacs very well from Fever. I didn't know of Fever, but then after I started clicking around, I was like, oh, I've heard of the work that they've been doing. And you've all just mentioned people feeling like things were out of reach. And I feel like Fever somehow taps into making things not only accessible, but like, oh, I want to do that. And he'll talk about that in the field of classical music, particularly when David Bale and Mara Driscoll talked to me about this panel. She said that she felt that Fever operates more as a technology platform as much as a performing arts company. And so we can hear some from Jason and see how that might apply to the work that we do in this field.
Thank you so much. Hello, everyone. I'm Jason Kovacs. I'm the head of theater over at Fever. And at Fever, we're using technology to democratize access to live entertainment all across the globe. And I think it's really interesting what we're hearing, particularly about audiences post-COVID and that kind of like push and pull between the old way and the new way and what that kind of looks like today. I know when we look at audiences at Fever, we know that when people came back, we saw that there was this trend right away that people wanted to go out as soon as those restrictions were lifted. But we not only saw that they wanted to go out, but they wanted to go out in new, and we were seeing these kind of new trends and patterns that were becoming clear, and they were moving at such a rapid pace that they were changing faster than we'd ever seen them before. And so what we kind of started to realize is that there's this question in the industry that's already a relatively pretty risky industry to be producing in, where we're looking at how do we predict, not just how we predict demand, but how do we predict demand when it's changing at such a rapid pace. And what Fever has done is we look at these kind of two key components that you've all kind of already alluded to. The first, which is obviously art. Art is driving this industry. When there's good art, audiences are going to come. But the second is one that I don't think we necessarily are looking at as robustly or haven't looked at as robustly as an industry, and that's science and data, and that's really the root of Fever. On a pretty macro level, we know that data is valuable. We know, we look at names and emails and addresses, and we use that to reach people. But what Fever is doing is we're using that data, we're using different kinds of data to predict trends and the likelihood that we can sell tickets into the future, not just really helping us to sell tickets right now. And what we do is we have two different platforms that we kind of use to do that. So first, we have Fever as a marketplace, which is just where you're going to go to actually buy a ticket. But what we recognized pretty early on is that it's not just enough to have access be where you're meeting the customer. You have to really inspire the customer and help them to make the decision. So we created the Secret Media Network, which operates in more than 170 cities around the world. So you may be familiar with Secret. It's Secret NYC, Secret Los Angeles, Secret London, Secret Lisbon. And the intent there is that we're kind of hyper-localized in each city, with the intent to engage with that customer before they've made that decision to purchase, really telling them what to be doing, guiding their decisions before they've made up their mind. And what that's enabled us to do is understand buying habits and trends behind purchase behaviors we see from each customer. And we can get kind of incredibly granular with what that data is and how understanding who's making those decisions and how they're making them. And as a result, we've kind of created really incredible partnerships with clients all around the world, perhaps none as impactful as the one that we've created with the Royal Opera House out in Madrid. So the Royal Opera House has been producing work for decades and decades. They may be here, I'm not sure if they're here today. But we started meeting with them back in 2019, and they said, we know how to create the work, we know we have the art, but there is an audience that we haven't hit, and there's millions of people in the Metro Madrid area who haven't been to the work we're creating, and how do we hit them? How do we get them with the work that we have? And we kind of walked away from that conversation and looked at the data that we had from Secret Media, and we happened to have a pulse on that younger generation, the millennials, the Gen Zs, and we knew that the biggest problem was probably not the content, but the format of the content. So when we were looking at the 2.5-hour long form operatic classical music that wasn't necessarily going to hit the mark for that millennial Gen Z audience. And what we came back to the Royal Opera House with was, what if we really met the audience, to Deeksha's point, where they were at, and reformulated a little bit to create a concept that would speak to them in the kind of work that they're interested, or the kind of content that they're interested in. And at the time, the Royal Opera House was saying, we're pretty comfortable with what we're doing. We know that the work is good. We want to keep doing the work. So we kind of stepped away from that conversation and said, well, what if we put our money where our mouth is and really create a concept that exactly speaks to this intent? And so we actually ended up renting a church in Madrid on a Tuesday night and filled it with hundreds of candles, hired a string quartet to play that music that they were already performing at the Royal Opera House, Mozart, Bach, Beethoven, and just kind of started to sell tickets to see if there was a there. And we sold hundreds of tickets very quickly, and kind of that was the initial concept of the Candlelight Concert Series, which has now been to more than 170 cities around the world. Within 18 months, we went from selling 0 classical music tickets to 4 million, not 4 million. By 2022, we had sold 4 million tickets in classical concerts. And we actually are now the largest global distributor of classical music out there. And what's so interesting about that is not just that we moved so quickly from a data-informed place, but also that we specifically have the average age of ticket buyers being the age that the Royal Opera House was targeting. So our average age for candlelight concerts is 36, 37, which is even younger than that Broadway average age. So the point in all of this is to say that we're using that data, that information to inform decisions, to ultimately create experiences that speak to audiences and ultimately build larger audiences in a way that's scalable all around the world.
Thank you, Jason. So we have with us Sebastián Blutrach, and he is going to have the help of Ariel Stoller for translation. Sebastián runs the Argentine Association of Theatrical and Music Productions, but he also is a producer and runs Teatro Piccolo. And Ariel, just so you know, is a producer and runs Paseo La Plaza, also in Buenos Aires. I happened to be there on a film shoot recently, and I was amazed at the vibrancy of the performing arts there, and also how crowded the streets were at 1 a.m. with people eating and seeing things. So when we all met, I learned about how resilient and flexible and collaborative the sector is there. So Sebastián's going to tell us about what it's like there, and we can see what lessons there are for us to learn. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Elena, and the organization for inviting me. I'm the president of ADET. ADET is the National Association of Producers of Theater and Live Music Shows and owners of the venues. We are more than 200 members, and y representamos un sector dentro del teatro, lo que sería el teatro comercial, el teatro privado.
We represent within the ecosystem the commercial sector, the commercial producers and theater owners.
Well, why the organization invite us? 3 weeks ago, we posted in social media the statistics of our sector, and we have excellent numbers. So that's new after pandemic. So I will share some statistics of our sector. For example, last year we sold 4 million tickets in the season, only in theaters in all the country. We recuperate the activity before the pandemics with 12,900 performances reached. It's okay. And we have a great average, the best average for the last 10 years for tickets sold in each performance, with 309 tickets sold. And another item interesting interesting is that the half audience in Buenos Aires City is for the 10 most successful productions with 70,000 tickets sold each one. The other half is for more or less 500 productions. Well, why we have these numbers? Well, I will try to explain a few items that I understand that it's the reason. After pandemics, another subsector of our ecosistema teatral, the independent sector is a very interesting sector with more than 200 small theaters in Buenos Aires City. Couldn't return earlier because they are small theaters with bad ventilations, and the audience was afraid to return to those places. So the best success productions of these theaters moved to our theaters. Besides this, the public theaters release or license their productions to producers or to the cast that make cooperatives to run these shows and move to our theaters. This was great because we have new contents with a high quality contents and with a lower price. So we didn't have to produce because after pandemics it was really difficult for us because we produce with our fund, no?
The own money.
The own money, so this an excellent option. It was excellent too because the younger audience wants to see these shows with a lower price. So we start another way of program in our theaters called perhaps multi-programming. Imagine here if you have a main production sharing the stage with, for example, 3 or 4 other productions. Well, in our theaters we start with this system, and usually we have 6 or 8 performances in a week, and with the multi-program we have, for example, 12 or 15 performances in a week, with different kinds of shows, and the younger and with a lower price. This is very interesting for the younger audience. Besides this, new genres like small musicals or one-man or woman show, not the classical stand-up, perhaps not dramatic monologues, digital tending content from like podcast or radio streaming shows or just influencers from social media. Wants to make live shows in our theater. We could recognize that part of the audience was interested to see this new talent grew in the social media making live shows. So, well, we have great results. The discussion inside the sector is perhaps this is not the traditional performing arts, but it is an interesting discuss because we have to, nosotros tenemos que estar pensando en cómo mantener la audiencia, cómo hacerla crecer, and how to be relevant for our community.
We had to think how to stay relevant and how to interpret whatever the audiences want as well.
Well, beside this, our sector have an exempt status of federal taxes. This is really interesting because the main actors and actresses and the directors and all the community of the workers of theater tienen un incentivo to stay in theater.
The tax-exempt status in Argentina incentivizes actors, directors, authors, and producers to invest in the theater and commit to the theater.
This not happen in TV or cinema. So, and another interesting item is that the budgets of the productions are most invariable costs. For example, the main actors and actresses, their incomes are in a percentage of the gross. The venues don't ask for advance to the producers or a weekly guarantee. And this, todo esto permite que cada año tengamos grandes títulos y una cartelera muy diversa, ¿no?
All of these help lower the risk, the financial risk, so there are more productions willing to commit to the stage.
Well, what I'm talking about is about flexibility and resilience. In Argentine, these two words are necessary to survive. We live several economical crises, so the resilience and flexibility is our mark. Well, thank you. Gracias.
Sebastián, you mentioned the phrase, what audiences want. I'm just curious for each of you, what do you think audiences want and how has that shifted? And of course, in this country and then the reverberations after the killing of George Floyd led to not only an openness for different kinds of stories and a richness of programming, but an expectation and almost a demand, which I think is a wonderful thing. I'll start with you, Yuval, about what you think audiences have been wanting and receptive.
Okay, so I think that's a really good but tricky question for me to think about because I have like an angel and a demon on my two shoulders that have a different answer to this. So on one hand, and I don't know which one's which necessarily, but maybe we'll find out. There's something that I have never forgotten that the impresario, opera impresario Gérard Mortier, who very briefly almost came to New York to run the New York City Opera. It didn't turn out this way, but I remember him speaking to the board. I was working at New York City Opera at the time, and he said something that I've really never forgotten, which he said, you can't give the audience what it wants, but you should give the audience what it doesn't yet know it needs. And I loved that because with the former phrase, you can't give the audience, you give the audience what it wants, implies for me something really condescending, and also implies a sense of you know better as a producer. And I'm going to now administer to you what I think you know that you want, and it is a very closed circle in that way. And from the artistic point of view, that means there's no oxygen left to really push forward into something new, because you're constantly in the trap of, well, we need to serve the audience what it wants, you know? I also have always had to say I've questioned even that logic. How do we know what an audience wants? Yes, we can do metrics. I know a lot of my fellow panelists are very good with metrics, so yes, we could probably read that very well, but there's that kind of ineffable something else that does not fall into where metrics are, right? Like, and I struggle with this with my staff in Detroit too, which is saying, we need to program a Verdi opera first thing in the season. And I think, well, I mean, I guess we can, and I have nothing against Verdi at all, but I also just wonder, why don't we just wonder about another way of doing things? I mean, so that's the part of me that has kind of Mortier's voice in my ear, which is, yeah, okay, we maybe we know what the audience says they want, but don't we go to the arts to experience something completely different from anything that we know? You know, isn't it like that encounter with something really different that absolutely galvanizes your attention that you could never have predicted? That's what I would prefer to offer to an audience. But I also have to admit that then the challenge of communicating that to a potential audience is considerable. So I do have to give that. That becomes part of the equation. But for me, it's just always, you know, when the art leads with that, as opposed to saying, you know, the audience wants Verdi. Well, you know, we're going to do Verdi. We're an opera house, but what is it that they don't yet know that they need? And that's what I'm more interested in pursuing personally.
I remember hearing Bob Hurwitz, who used to run None Such Records, say, I don't want to do focus groups to know what artists to feature and what to release. I have ears, I have instincts, and you can pick the artists that people are going to just be wowed by, but that they didn't know about, to your point. But I'm going to throw this to Jason because I feel like what you all did was you went to a younger generation that wasn't going to classical music concerts, and you somehow served it up in a way where they're like, we didn't know we wanted this, but this is great, we love it. And I also, when I was looking at Fever's website, like you can go and buy a ticket, but you can also like add on experiences, and then you can be like, have a private concert in your home, and it costs this, like it makes it so easy and accessible, and the system adapts to what the person who's clicking around wants to do, not the big paradigm where you have a set number of choices that is inflexible. So just curious how you would respond.
Definitely. I think it's interesting. I think, I relate to what you're saying, Yuval, and it's funny because obviously Fever is a very data-driven platform, but at the same time, there is that X factor. There's the art piece of it where you say well, I don't want to put it all into the numbers. I don't want to say it all has to be this way. But then, you look at Candlelight and you see oh, this sold a crazy amount of tickets. This sells on an ongoing basis. We do 300 Candlelight concerts a week. And what we were looking at that time when we were trying to decide what to put together was what is the data telling us? And it doesn't even have to be numbers. It doesn't have to be metrics. But anecdotally, if you're looking at what's driving behavior from this audience, if I'm looking at the Gen Zs or millennials, we're looking at secret media. It's not just saying oh, this is what specific, XYZ number tells us, but we're seeing that they're specifically interested in this type of content, whether that is Instagrammable content, imagery, ambiance. Those are things that it's not necessarily that you can say oh, X% of whatever, but it's talking more in terms of the pattern you're seeing, and then you put that together, you kind of create an experience around that, and you can really take off from there. And I think, I think it should help, the data piece of it should help inform where the art goes.
I'd like to, so there's one piece of it, which is what does the audience want in terms of the art, and I'm not going to speak to that. But what I am going to speak to is what does an audience want out of an experience, out of a night out, out of leaving their home and their comfort and going somewhere else? And I'll tell you what audiences don't want anymore, which is to go into spaces where they're made to feel like they don't belong, where there are rules, where they've put down a lot of cash for an experience they're not sure what it's going to be like. And frankly, they don't feel welcome. And I will tell you, I have now spent 2 decades in this industry, and there is not a theater I don't walk into with a pit in my stomach, where it's I just hope no one gives me, I won't say the word, right? And that is a real thing. If I'm with someone who's chewing a candy or opens a bottle of water, I get tense. This is not a space, I am in the industry and I recognize this is not a space for me. And people will remind me of it. And that is real. So if you don't want to change the art, I would really highly recommend people here interrogate their spaces. I have these moments, right, where I'm very privileged in my career to have access to a lot of leadership of theatrical and performing arts organizations. And I've had conversations with them where I've said, did you know that a friend of mine came to see a show and had this experience at your theater? And they have no idea. And they are mortified. And it is horrible. And it is not their fault that that experience happened. But if they want to know why people aren't coming back, that might explain it. So one of the things I would really encourage us all to think about is, what is the experience we're creating in our spaces and for whom? The Broadway now has the playbill. Has anyone been to a Broadway show recently? Show of hands. Has anyone read the recent etiquette page where they yell at you before you sit down in the theater about how you are and aren't supposed to behave? Who's that for? I'm genuinely asking who is the audience they're pleasing in that equation. So I think, getting real about who your audience is, who you want in there, and how you're going to cater to that is real. And I'll just throw one stat in because I am a data person. I was revisiting an article that came out at the end of last year about performing arts attendance being down. It was a study published by the NEA between 21 and 22. And what's really interesting is the article was written in a sort of doom and gloom way about how attendance across all these categories were down. But then they said, other performing arts, which is music, comedy, concerts, shows, was up 6%. It was the only statistic that was the percentage where it was up. They also showed where they did a breakdown of how people engage with the arts online. And for audiences of color, they are engaging with art online at a significantly higher rate than white audiences. That is telling us something. I mean, I have my guess, you'll have your interpretation, but I'm reading that and thinking, they're audiences who are about art, they're about storytelling, and they're engaging in ways that are safe to them. So.
That's so well said. And from the opera world, everything that you said about the etiquette, I haven't seen this in the playbill yet, but I think that is one of the hugest barriers for those of us involved in opera, with an opera house. Okay, so in Los Angeles, I've had the good fortune of doing projects in train stations and in moving vehicles and in parks and in places where the audience, the spectator to artist relationship is a really unknown quantity for everyone. That's part of the adventure of a site-specific work or environmental work. And I've also been struggling going to Detroit with a theater that's 2,700 seats and this perceived idea of how we're meant to behave in the theater. And so I've been, in my off time, I've been doing a little bit of research. How did audiences behave in opera when it was at its heyday? And I don't think, for those of you that don't know opera so well, this might come as a surprise, but people barely paid attention to what was going on stage. They were eating, they were drinking, they were doing other things behind closed curtains in a box, that you were not meant to know about. They were going to see and be seen, and then there'd be a moment that arrested them. An aria would happen that would just absolutely silence the house and it'd be a magical moment. But it was a social experience. It was an opportunity where actually the etiquette seemed really lax, and I love that notion. I haven't yet been able to convince everyone in Detroit to kind of do even things like, can you bring food in the theater? That seems like maybe a good place to start. Like maybe some alcohol in the theater, to just have people realize they're there to also be entertained. So I really hear what you're saying, and in a city like Detroit that has, that is a predominantly black city, looking at the demographics of our audience coming to Detroit and why they don't come, the perception is an overbearing sense of rules. And so I want to follow in what you're saying in terms of trying to push us to open that up more.
Yeah, and I think one of the really cool conversations we were having sort of over the last few days as we sort of talked about this panel is the opportunity of the moment is that the rules don't necessarily have to apply in the same ways that they used to. So there's opportunities to test the limits, to take your take the things that you've always seen as sacred and just maybe give them a little bit of a nudge. And I think, this is what Jason and his team did at Fever. They took a sort of a rule of this is the way things are done in this format and pushed it, and now it's an incredibly successful program that many are trying to replicate. So, yeah.
Excuse me, I will speak in Spanish this part. Lo más interesante en nuestra recuperación de audiencias, más allá de que nuestros espectáculos principales son el clásico teatro de texto o el musical.
In our case, recovering audiences within a context that we do traditional theater, traditional performing arts.
se rompieron muchos prejuicios en el traspaso de circuitos. El circuito independiente, que es muy precario, pero que tiene una gran fuerza de creación, pasó con sus espectáculos a los teatros comerciales, lo cual era impensado hace tiempo.
We broke several barriers. For instance, we had what we call the independent sector that is run by their own artists, and that there was no connection between them and the commercial sector. But we broke that barriers, and many shows transferred from one sector to the other.
Lo mismo con el teatro público, ¿no? Que son producciones que no buscan el éxito comercial, sino que buscan una alta calidad artística.
And the same with the public theater, that it's not focused on the commercial side, but on the artistic quality of the shows.
Y este traspaso fue muy virtuoso para todas las partes, porque nosotros pudimos, dentro de lo que es el teatro privado y comercial, pudimos acceder a nuevas audiencias y a grandes contenidos artísticos.
But this wave of transfer was beneficial for everybody. Everybody got something out of it.
Y para ellos también, porque no solo pudieron acceder a un mayor ingreso económico, que es una gran limitación de esos sectores, sino a nuevas audiencias.
Yes, because artists got more income and then got recognition from new audiences as well.
Para tener un ejemplo, el sector independiente es el único que recibe subsidios o apoyos del Estado.
As an example, the independent sector is the one that gets subsidy from the state.
They work in cooperatives, and the money that the artist's income is not enough to live.
They form collective projects, but the money that they got out of it is very small.
So when they come to our theaters, it was great for everyone. It was great because we have audience for these shows, and for them it's a surprise that they can put a higher price, a higher ticket, and the audience answered, coming. Muy bien.
It was a win-win proposition.
Y más allá de todos los artistas provenientes de social media, que no es el performing art tradicional, no, ha sido una buena solución para nosotros.
But beyond alternative artists that came out of social media, it was a good transition and a good solution for us, for the theaters as well.
Para sobrevivir la pospandemia, después del duro golpe que fue para nosotros tener los teatros cerrados por un año.
To go through the pandemic, because we had the theaters closed for almost 1 year.
Lo que no sabemos es cuál es el futuro de ese tipo de artistas dentro del circuito, porque no están concebidos para shows en vivo.
But we still don't know whether those new artists are meant for the stage or they're just transitional.
Lo que sí creo que ha venido para quedarse es la multiprogramación. Share the stage with different productions. This comes to stay.
But what we do know is that this idea of multi-programming different productions sharing the same stage or the same days is something new that it's going to stay.
Jason, you had seemed like you wanted to jump in earlier. Did you have or if not, I have a question for you. We were talking about the social media, and I know that Sebastian had talked to me about how some of these artists are reaching larger audiences because of the way the sectors are cooperating, which is great in terms of visibility of new artists and cross-fertilization. I'm curious, Jason, Deeksha shared a Washington Post article that said that in terms of ticket buying, social media accounted for 17% of why people bought certain shows. Friends and family, the enduring way that we know what to see, was 15%, and print and broadcast media was 11%. Jason, I'm curious because you mentioned visual and Instagrammable content. And we know that while live ticket sales are generally down, people's digital engagement is higher, and as Deeksha mentioned, it's higher among certain communities. What's your kind of experience with that?
Yeah, I mean, most of the marketing that we're doing for Fever events is primarily on digital. Not, I don't know how many people here are still doing, mailings directly to people's houses, but I think that those just, that kind of marketing, I don't think it's trackable. It's not, we can't see how well it's working anymore. And I think that there is a certain kind of like aspect of that's how we've always done it. So we just continue to put X number of dollars toward that kind of marketing. But with the media that we see going out, for Fever anyway, in the digital space, we're able to literally track it and say, oh, this actually is working, and then we can make really informed decisions about this is appealing to this audience, and this is actually speaking to, converting directly into purchases. And when you can see that, then you really are making more informed decisions with your marketing dollars, and not just kind of like throwing it into the air and hoping that it comes back to you later on,
Deeksha, I know you said you're a recovering marketing person. In terms of marketing and ticket prices, do you have any observations to share about the way ticket pricing might have changed? And in our pre-meeting, we were talking about pricing things to sell at that price point rather than having a price and then heavily discounting.
Yeah, I mean, it's a big question. But I think I would summarize it by my answer by saying, we have a perception problem in the industry. We have a perception problem because whatever the realities of our costs of production are, and the costs of production going up at a significantly higher rate than the costs of tickets, that's not what the consumer is seeing. They're just seeing an industry that gets further and further out of reach. Now, not to shamelessly plug TKTS and TDF, but there is some logic, I think, to saying, well, we have to price it a certain way, but there are other channels like Fever or TKTS or other channels where you can sort of reach the audiences that you want to reach. So you can reach a younger audience on Fever, or the sort of Times Square crowd at the TKTS booth or whatever. So it's a complex equation. I don't think I would speak to pricing as a sort of like, here is the one recommendation that works for everyone. But I do think we do have a huge perception problem that is not helping us right now. But on the other hand, my favorite thing to talk about these days are Beyonce and Taylor Swift, who just, people were spending thousands and thousands of dollars to fly places to get the ticket. I think, what was the statistic? Like 40 billion to the 40, I don't know. Some very, very unimaginable number that was contributed to the economy of those shows. And why were people willing to do that? People were willing to do that because it was an experience that was for them. And note, I'm not talking about the art. I'm just saying that the experience of it was for them. The fact that in the Renaissance tour, all the bathrooms were gender neutral, because they know their audience. The fact that I went to see Beyonce in London, and basically from 10 tube stops away from the stadium, the entire tube car was glitter. And I was like, oh, I'm with my people. Literally, it was just sparkling. And we sort of all filtered out and walked to the stadium together, a million strangers connected. We were with our people. And so I think experiences, and Sebastián, you were talking earlier about, the 1 a.m. shows that drew a specific crowd, that was a specific experience. And so I think we have to get a little bit more clever about the experiences we're creating, both in the sort of barrier ways that I mentioned earlier, but also in the really fun ways, or what you did in LA or even in Detroit. It would be great for you to speak to that.
Can I just say, just because you and Jason both did things in parking lots during COVID, so if we could talk about that, and then maybe you could move to Deeksha's general question.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, for some context as to what Deeksha is referring to and to what Elena was referring to. So my first project, when I was offered the job in Detroit, I think there was the suggestion that eventually the theater would reopen, and then my tenure would really begin once COVID was gone. But I made it a stipulation that we'd have to do a show right away, even though it was June of 2020. For a couple reasons. I mean, one, I didn't want to wait 2 years of me being announced and then nothing happening. It didn't seem to make a lot of sense. But more importantly, I just recall that being a moment where, I'll speak specifically about opera, felt like nothing could happen. No one could imagine another form of creating opera than what we know in an opera house. And I really wanted to say, if I'm going to take this job, I also want to let the people of Detroit know there are other ways, like we're going to explore other ways of creating pieces. We're going to look at other ways of making opera, and ideally in a way that might speak more strongly to audiences that have never come to the Detroit Opera House for all of the reasons that we've been talking about. So to fast forward a little bit, the performance that we did was called Twilight Gods, and it was excerpts of the last opera of Wagner's Ring Cycle that took place in our parking garage. And 4 cars at a time drove through the parking garage, and on each level of the parking garage was a different scene from that opera. And the audience stayed in their cars and heard the whole thing live on their FM radios. So the gist of it was everyone stayed safe, right? We didn't share any space with anyone that wasn't in our bubble. And the artists, too, were kept safe by them being really small, little scenes, and for a different orchestration. But everything about it was an adaptation to the time that we were in. And that, I think, in terms of the audience experience, we had such exciting, I got to meet everybody in there from the car window. And I remember approaching one car, and they still wanted the kind of opera experience, so they attached a chandelier in the interior of their car and had it hanging there, and they were dressed in tuxedos, and the driver didn't have champagne, but the passenger did. They did want something about this experience still, and found a way to adapt the experience to the interior of their car. And I don't know, it was a really thrilling moment, I think, and one that I still hold on to as saying, like, this indicates that there really is, to what Jason was saying earlier, there, and also really what Deeksha said about the changing of what it means to actually go through the experience of art from beginning to end. It really does motivate people to try things they wouldn't have tried before. So I don't know. It was a really a good kickoff, and yeah, it was only the first parking garage piece that we did. We did several others since then, but it was
I was going to say, yeah, I think you mentioned adaptability, and I think it's interesting. Like COVID, obviously awful time, horrible thing, obviously really detrimental for our industry, but in some ways really pushed the industry forward because it gave us the opportunity to play in a space that we hadn't played before, and that and kind of rise to that adaptability. And really similarly, as Elena mentioned, Fever also was working in that kind of parking garage space. We had a partnership with Netflix where we were working to develop a Stranger Things immersive experience, obviously kind of sidelined by the pandemic, and we noticed that a lot of people or organizations around the world were doing that kind of drive-in movie experience. We decided to create a drive-into immersive Stranger Things world that happened downtown in LA, and it similarly took you through this area called Row downtown, where you went through and then went up into the parking garage, and we did the FM radio frequency kind of thing. And everyone was just in their car, but very similarly, you created the upside down in Stranger Things. It was really awesome, and audiences really responded to it, so much so that after, when it was safe to do so, we turned it into an immersive walkthrough experience that has played all over the world. So, that kind of gave us this jumping off point of what that kind of immersive world could be. And I think we saw that, in some ways we kind of pushed ourselves so far during that time. And then I think we moved back into like, oh, like this is how we did it before, so this is how we should keep on doing it. But in some ways, that really closes off a huge segment of the audience that we had captured during that time that we maybe are no longer speaking to because we just went back to things as normal. So.
I think programmatically, some of the offerings got more diverse or gave us different opportunities to present different kinds of work. Sebastián, in terms of the work that was presented that really found audiences and the 1 a.m. Curtain time shows that you do, plus Friday morning, what kinds of shows were you, or sorry, Sunday morning, what kinds of shows were you starting to present at unconventional times, and what kind of audiences came out?
Well, I will say it in Spanish. En los horarios alternativos que trabajamos, por ejemplo, domingos 11:30 de la mañana, o los sábados temprano, o incluso funciones a las 12:30 de la noche, son espacios donde, digamos, buscamos otro tipo de audiencias para nuestros espacios.
So the alternative curtain times that we develop, for instance, Sunday morning or late at night, at midnight on Saturdays or Fridays, are spaces that we tend to allow for different type of shows, different type of audiences as well.
Por ejemplo, espectáculos que a las 11:30 yo había trabajado con un director que se llama Daniel Veronese y hacíamos espectáculos de día con luz natural en un teatro que tenía una claraboya. Entonces son experiencias completamente distintas al teatro tradicional, donde se busca incluir a la audiencia en lo que está sucediendo. No hay otra comunicación entre los actores y la audiencia.
So, for instance, we develop plays on early Sundays, and we use natural lights, and we involve the audiences. The participation of the audience is expected to be different as well.
Y después los espectáculos de trasnoche o digamos, por ejemplo, en mi teatro hay funciones de lunes a lunes, todos los días hay distintos espectáculos y cada día está dirigido a un tipo de audiencia distinto y para... ¿Querés?
Yes, so we try to offer performances every day of the week, and for each day we try to integrate performances for different type of audiences as well. For instance, on the midnight shows.
Y es importante para un espacio mantener una línea editorial artística para que la audiencia sepa lo que va a ir a ver y fidelizar de alguna manera lo que ya los abonos no pueden hacer.
So our challenge is how to sustain a curatorial identity and how to engage with the audiences and develop loyalty when models such as the subscription model, it's not as hard as well.
Por ejemplo, en mi teatro yo puse solo un día a la semana donde tenía artistas que venían de social media para no confundir con la otra línea editorial que tiene el espacio.
So for instance, at my theater, I assigned just one day of the week for these alternative artists that came from social media, so as not to mess too much with my curatorial identity.
I need the incomes, but I don't want to program this. So, well, I have to survive. So, the challenge is how to present this, not to lose your identity. No, this is the challenge because we can't. You have to see what happened beside, and you have to do it to survive.
You mentioned the word loyalty, and in one of our conversations, Jason, you just mentioned what does loyalty look like in a post-pandemic world. So I'm curious about the general idea of loyalty, subscriptions tied to donors, and how that's at play with what you are either doing or observing. But I'll start with you, Jason.
Yeah, I think, I don't think it's news to anyone that the subscription model has been waning years and years and years for the past years and years and years. And I'll speak specifically to my experience in the US because I don't know what it's like elsewhere, but I think before the pandemic, it was already a relatively weak model, and then the pandemic really messed with it even further, so much so now that I think we're seeing those audiences haven't come back. It's not necessarily a reliant model anymore, and to create work where you know that you're not going to make your money back on ticket sales, and you're just going to be reliant on subscribers and moving them through to a customer journey that takes them from being a single ticket buyer to a subscriber to a donor to a lifelong member. I don't think there's necessarily realism to that in the same way anymore. And so, for when I think of the Fever point of view, we're not typically looking at it from that perspective, but we're trying to disrupt that model a little bit. And I don't have the answer necessarily, but I think we're just kind of starting to take a crack at like what exactly that looks like, moving the performing arts into the next decade, 2 decades, 3 decades.
Yeah, I'm sort of curious because I think my understanding is this idea of the traditional pyramid, right? The pyramid of the single ticket buyer becomes the subscriber, becomes the donor, becomes the board member. I'm not sure that that's how it works. And the analogy anymore, and the analogy I sort of think about a lot now is, I remember doing some research a couple of years ago, and 90% of people's purchase decisions begin on Google, right? So 90% of people considering buying anything start at Google. And then Google did this great sort of exercise of mapping out the customer journey, right? And it goes like this. Right, it's like all over the place. And we as consumers, so just wearing our consumer hats for a second, have become really good at sifting through, jumping tabs, looking at different pieces of information. What is the thing that's right, exactly right for me? Not just good enough, but like exactly right for me. And so I don't know. When I think about this, and I admit I have the luxury to think about this from a sort of ecosystem-wide perspective, but I kind of think that's where we have to go. Because collectively, as an industry, if people are spending $5,000 a year on our industry or $5,000 a year on your theater, I understand how that impacts your theater, but from a building audiences and consumer perspective, that's the same thing. They are engaging in the arts. And maybe at some point in their future, as we are seeing, people will say, okay, I actually want to become a donor here, or I want to become a board member here, or whatever it is we're looking for as our outcomes. But I want to reframe what the win is, right? Because if we have more people from more walks of life engaging in the arts, we are winning. So how can we build our financial models to match up with that, rather than holding on to a financial model that doesn't work for us anymore?
I think that
It also, sorry, I was going to say it all kind of comes back to that customer experience piece of it too, because you think about, all of the work that you have to do just to get them to purchase the ticket. And then you send them into your theater, and it goes back to that conversation from before of the theater etiquette, and you don't make them feel included, and you make them feel like an outsider, then they're not coming back for more. They're going to say, okay, I'm not spending my money here anymore. So it's really finding the ways to create that, like that is the customer journey. That is the piece of it that you have to focus on, rather than saying like, oh, we want to be able to get $10,000 over the lifespan of this person.
And it's also super interesting, sorry, passionate subject. Before TDF, I co-founded a website called showscore.com, which is a fan community for theater audiences. And one of the things we talked about all the time as a reason for creating ShowScore was, just say you're in an art gallery, a fine art gallery, and you see a painting and you don't like it. you don't generally say, well, I don't like paintings. But if you go to the theater and you have a bad experience, how many people do you know who said, well, theater's not for me, opera's not for me, I'm just not an opera fan, and they have written off an entire genre, an entire modality of working because of one bad experience. If that is the reality for most people, I think we would want to be more precious with that first experience, right?
But it is for opera. That happens all the time.
All the
for opera.
time,
Yeah.
right? I was just at a performance of Hell's Kitchen at the Public, which is the new Alicia Keys musical, and with 300 17-year-olds who are the sort of core audience for this show, and it may have been the best theatrical experience I've ever had. And this was with TDF's education programs, and one of the things that I love about TDF's education programs is that we educate the theater makers, not the audience. So the actors were prepared. They were told, this house can get rowdy, you may have to stop, they're gonna be hanging out in the lobby afterwards. This is what it's gonna be. And the artists just bought in. They bought in, they were there. I saw them try really hard not to break when they had their romantic kiss, and 300 17-year-olds went wild. They stayed in the lobby afterwards for an hour. It was like watching a rock concert. They were treated like celebrities. And it was just, you sort of felt like, okay, you know what? As a first moment, the first time at the theater, that was pretty special. So.
Excuse me.
I just want to say we're going to open it up soon for questions, and so those mics on both sides of the theater on the first two levels would be the place to go if you have questions for the panel. Please, Sebastián.
Creo que cuando conseguimos a través de esa curaduría tener una comunidad que viene a nuestro teatro,
When we are able to build a community that engages with the theater,
lo más importante es cuidar esa comunidad, porque ellos son quienes van a hacer nuestro marketing.
the important thing is how we take care of that community, because they will market ourselves.
It's really easier transmitir la experiencia, que ellos la transmitan, más que nosotros estar buscando nuevas audiencias, ¿no?
It's more helpful when we have our audiences share their experiences rather than trying to engage with new people once at a time.
Solo eso.
I was thinking about that as well. Actually, I was going to ask you, Sebastián, with your, I'll talk slower, sorry, with your different performance times, like when you get people coming into those, like what is the cultural experience? Because I think that that's one of the key attributes that we have to kind of look at when we're programming those different audience times or trying to reach new different kinds of cultural groups. You're not going to speak to that same experience. Not everyone experiences in the same way the art that they see. So I remember, for example, when I went to see The Color Purple on Broadway 10 years ago at the climactic I'm here moment, it was going to church, it was gospel, it was amazing. And I remember hearing the audible enthusiasm from the audience, which is so not, it wasn't applause, it wasn't a standing ovation, it was different, it was going to church. And that spoke to that audience segment. And I'm just curious, I guess, for the group, Sebastián in particular, like how do we meet that need to speak to different cultural experience?
And I just want to say we do have some people lined up with burning questions for the panel. So Sebastián, if you just want to respond very briefly to his question, that would be great.
Bueno, en mi teatro hay un bar, un restaurante, y eso me permite trabajar mucho la experiencia y los diferentes horarios, ¿no? Desde la gastronomía uno puede acompañar esa experiencia.
So, for instance, in my theater, I have a restaurant, so that gave me the opportunity to expand the experience and the curtain times as well.
With the time and with the different audiences, no? With, for example, un show a medianoche puedo preparar tragos o promociones especiales que vayan en línea con el show y lo mismo la experiencia gastronómica.
Expanding the experiences. For instance, a midnight show will engage with the bar with a different menu as well.
Un poco como Deeksha decía, buscar hacer sentir cómodo a la supuesta audiencia que viene a ver cada show, ¿no? Vuelvo al principio, flexibilidad para tratar de entender a la audiencia convocada a cada espectáculo.
So to be as flexible as possible and to engage with the audiences, thinking about their experiences as well.
Okay.
The overall
so
experience.
I think we should open it up by seeing Anthony Sargent at the mic, and I'm always curious what he has to say. So let's open it up.
Just very quick, just to go back to something Yuval said very early on, that everything seemed possible in 2020 and now the empire strikes back. And I just want to say, I've spent the last 3 years writing 2 big studies for the University of Leeds in the UK, globally, on exactly that point. The first study was the studies about the relationship between COVID and the cultural sector globally. And you're absolutely right, globally, that in 20 and 21, all kinds of doors and windows were opened in people's mind creatively, managerially, financially, in marketing, every dimension of the relationship between culture and its consumers. Doors and windows were opened in 20 and 21 that have begun to close for exactly the reasons you said. And I think it's a tragedy and it's an awful thing. And I think we should all be committed to preventing the empire striking back.
Hear, hear.
Thank you. I'm glad that resonated because it's really, and I'm sure there are metrics to chart that, so it's good to hear about. I'd love to read your report on it, but it's something I sense, like I feel it, like I feel the doors closing, and I'm really pushing against those doors because I feel like we discovered a lot in the period where we could not do business as normal. So the seduction of business as normal creeping back into the way that we think about everything is just the thing that we have to sort of snap ourselves out of. I do think that's where artists are particularly useful because that is part of our job. So as an artist as well, that is something that I naturally carry with me, but I hope that all of you in your own capacities can find ways to remember what that felt like, to try something different in 2020 and 2021 and say, we can't do it the way we did it in the past. What new discoveries are there to be had that might open new possibilities?
A colleague who works in theater told me that he was so excited by changes in the US and he works in the UK, and then he felt that retrenchment when it was possible to go back to normal. People just went to what they knew before and got a little less, or maybe a lot less courageous. I'm going to say, could you please introduce yourself before you ask a question? Thank you.
Thank you so much for what has been shared so far. My name is Nazli Tabatabay Khaltambakhsh, and I'm Professor of Dramatic Writing at the Guildhall School of Music and Drama in London. And now for the question, if I may. I'm curious, when you're collaborating, in order to continually be welcoming your new audience, how do you go beyond agreeing to disagree?
Well, we're just remarking on how wonderful that question was. As a way of buying ourselves time for figuring out how to answer it.
Do you take your time? I am curious.
I'm curious too, and I think that, there's a lot of layers on which you could address the notion of agreeing to disagree, and
I'm going beyond that.
And going beyond it, right?
Yes.
I'll let you go, Deeksha.
I'm gonna
answer the question. Yes.
Well, I don't know if I'm going to answer the question. I'm going to attempt to answer the question by saying that I think that it's more conversation. The example that comes to mind, and this was a very unique situation when I worked at a theater in DC called Woolly Mammoth. We had an artist who had been extremely popular at the theater and then sort of ended up being quite polarizing and had sort of done some actions that some of our audience wasn't very happy with, and we continue to produce his work. And in response to all the very passionate, sometimes vitriolic feedback we decided to all just get in a room together, and everyone was invited, and it was not fun. It was not pleasant. It was extremely important, and maintained trust with all audiences that we were listening, they were being heard, and there was some really valid feedback too, you know. And so I think sometimes we maybe try to focus on comfort, right, rather than the actual goal. And I think, you know, something that my team has heard me say a lot recently is, let's get comfortable with being uncomfortable. So maybe that would be a suggested approach. I don't know if that answers the question, but
It delightfully begins to.
One of the things that occurred to me, and I forget, I can't remember the person's name, the Canadian gentleman who presented yesterday first in the afternoon, but when he was talking about the labels of who's producer and who's associate producer and how it's tied to economics and stuff, and how there's a new way of thinking of how that it can exist, then what came to mind is if there's a disagreement, then those decisions are no longer made by the same power dynamic maybe than there was before. I know there are more questions, but if anyone had a response.
I think that I think my own response to that would be, and otherwise I could take the rest of our 15 minutes talking about it. So just as a quick response, I will say that one of the powers of, I'll just say theater broadly, I find it a particular power in opera, is to welcome people into another perspective of seeing the world, and what it means to walk in someone else's shoes, what it means to have a different point of view, that we are actively eschewing a sense of monotonous thinking, that we must all fall in line with one way of being, but we must find ways to recognize each other in all of our splendid humanity. And I do think opera has that potential in it because of how many different artists need to participate and collaborate to make a work of art. Like any work of art, really, but opera takes it, like opera's on steroids when it comes to that kind of thing, right? It's suddenly so many different artists. And I think that the process of making the art can always contain within it that sense of dialogue that you captured, how to make sure the audience feels that this is not a lecture, that they have attended, but they have attended a work of art that will awake a lot of maybe conflicting feelings, and maybe also invite them to think about the world in a different way. Making sure that audiences understand that that's part of the rules of engagement. I think that goes beyond. So from the artist side, I do think about that dialogue happening in the rehearsal room. And as artistic director of an opera company, I want to make sure people realize they are permitted to come in with their whole being and their whole way of thinking, as long as they recognize everyone else's opportunity for having a different opinion and a different thought, and trying to eschew that sense of a monomania and a monolith. That might sound quite abstract, but when it starts from a philosophy, then you look for practical ways to alert the audience. I think you're right, Deeksha, that dialogue is a huge part of it. Thinking about audience talk, there's so many mechanisms for doing it, but I think realizing that can be a really central way to make sure everyone does feel comfortable with the discomfort.
Please, with your question, thank you.
Well, it's not a question. I would like to share quickly an experience that we had. So I'm Michel Gagnon from Lugano Art Cultural Center. In the preoccupation of bringing back young audience after the pandemic, we decide that we are going to offer to the citizen, to the public, to the possibility to become a member of the Art Center. For 200 francs, you can buy at any time of the year, your member pass, and it's for 12 months. What you have with this, we are offering you to come to performances that we are offering to you, mostly contemporary dance and contemporary theater. So with this system, we had much more audience, young public, obviously, for the contemporary arts. And so the age is also much more younger. So becoming a friend, and then you have 3 performances. Okay?
That goes back to Deeksha, you're talking about barriers to access. Yeah.
I think that also speaks, I mean, you look at what movie theaters are doing with like AMC A-List or, Movie Pass, whether or not it was successful. People wanted to make more last-minute decisions. They wanted it to be really easy to go to the theater or to go to the movie theater. And I have thought about this several times throughout the past, couple of years. Is we make it so difficult. You really have to plan in advance, or you might not get the seat you want, or you might not be able to, get access to the show because it might be sold out. Like, what if there was a Broadway pass or something? Whatever that might be. Like, I think that creating that kind of flexibility, some kind of membership program in some shape or form in even just a regional area could be really valuable and could get a lot more butts in seats.
Create a TKTS booth in your market.
Please.
Creo que introducir la suscripción en la juventud es realmente muy difícil, ¿no? Con los modelos que tienen de Spotify o las plataformas para ver películas o series.
So I think the idea of offering a subscription model for younger audiences is tricky because the way they understand it is different.
They have the contents all the day at any time. It's difficult for them to select one day to come to the theater. I think that we have to introduce different ways.
And I didn't comment on the subscription thing, even though I think about it a lot in Detroit. I have kind of similarly been trying to create something that I kind of jokingly with my colleagues in Detroit call it like the punch card. So like instead of a subscription, can we just have some sort of digital punch card that, once you've come back for your 5th opera, it's free or something? Kind of the way that like coffee shops work, or the kind of the way that the rest of our world works. Instead of a subscription that locks you into a date and to a seat and all these things.
And the biggest season for that matter.
Sorry?
And to a season for that matter.
And to it, exactly. So my biggest struggle with that was, I think actually everyone was really interested in that idea, but our whole business model is reliant on income coming to us at a certain point in the fiscal year, related to people buying tickets far enough in advance so that we can support making that work happen. So I just realized it's going to be more than just changing a subscription model. It's changing the whole model. Like, we just got to change everything.
Absolutely.
Like the whole thing's got to change and then we can come up with the right ticketing structure. But right now we're so locked into a way of producing that we can't change what seems like the most simple thing of just how our audience engages and buys a ticket for a show that we do.
Okay, we're going to wrap very soon. So there are 2 questions over here. I can't tell if you're standing at the mic or standing near the mic. You're standing at the mic. Okay, let's do question here, then here, and then here, and we'll have to be brief in our answers. And yeah, okay.
Thank you very much.
Please.
I'll be very brief. My name is Howard Jang. I run a small little community art center on the west coast of Canada on a very small island. My question really is about the way in which we think about what we engage with. And there's 2 areas that I think we do really well, and you've all spoken to it. One is we build anticipation for the performance. We have to build reasons for them to come. We build a way in which they say, I've got to be there. So there's that investment that we make. The second thing that we do is that we build a great experience once they're there. Great front of house, we've got great engagement within the theater, et cetera, et cetera. The third area, which I don't think we actually spend a lot of time with, but I'd love to hear some of your thoughts on this, is how can we build memory? how can we build the concept of memory of the performance? Because the memories last longer than the show. And we all can go back to say, I remember being at that show back in 1986, right? And that sense. And what memory does is also it builds loyalty. And it builds an opportunity to re-engage with them again. So do you have any thoughts about how we can continue to build that third leg, which I think is something we ignore quite a bit, just about memory?
Yeah, it's so funny because when Yuval was talking earlier about the parking lot concerts, et cetera, like that was where my head went, was memory, right? Because you're creating experience that is so unique or special, either in the individual's engagement with the piece or their engagement with their people while watching the piece. So I think, I sort of do think that if we think about what we do in terms of creating experiences, I sort of feel that memory piece comes as a result of that. And then our job as marketers or recovering marketers is to remind people of where they had that memory. Almost sort of, how on your phone sometimes, like on an iPhone, your memories from a year ago just pop up, and it's just this moment to feel that connection again. So I don't know, but I think what Jason was talking about with the candlelight concerts too. This is something that people automatically and organically want to record, and that's a big piece of it too. So
I think there's also something to like inviting people in, because so often we're really separated by that fourth wall, and there's the separation between who the audience is and who is performing. And that is one of the things that was cool about the parking lot kind of experience, or even just any immersive or experiential production, is you're in it. You're getting to experience it, so you do remember it in a different way than if you just saw it, in front of you, but weren't inside of it. So I think that breaking down that barrier, and even in other ways too, where like even when I take my playbill home at the end of a Broadway show, like I will like look at that, or I keep every playbill, like having those kinds of things where you can look back and say like, oh yeah, like I really do remember that because I was a part of that experience.
Okay, I promised that we'd get here and here, so why don't we do this? Please introduce your question briefly, both of you. Final thoughts, and then we wrap.
I promise. My question is very brief. Hi, my name is Ashley Offman. I am a student at the Master of Arts Management program at Carnegie Mellon University. And I just want to say really quick, I am TDF's biggest fan. Thank you, Deeksha, for everything that your organization does for making theater accessible for younger audiences like me. I guess here's my question. We're in New York, and something I've really noticed is that Broadway is really trending towards relying on celebrity casting to keep its numbers up. But this is also being responded to with dynamic pricing, seeing tickets for shows like Sweeney Todd, for example, going for $600-700 per head. With that, I'm seeing that there's also a sort of elitism with the audience of who's able to pay that $700 a ticket. And in kind of response to your playbill insert, I guess the question is, how do we respond to newer audiences that are coming into those spaces simply because they have the money to be able to do it, and they're not necessarily the ones who are growing up kind of in theater, and guess the people that are growing up in the theater and growing up with that experience rather than just growing up with the funds to be able to do so, if that makes sense.
Thanks for that thoughtful question. We're just going to hear this question, respond very briefly, and then you can ask them in the lobby for more advice or experience.
Well, my name's Brendan Jan Walsh from Amsterdam. I set up a classical music rave a while ago. We don't call people audience, but ravers, and festivals call them festival goers. The concerts you spoke about before, they speak about their fans, so why do we hang on to the term audience, which etymologically is very passive? It's a listener, it's a spectator, it's not somebody who actually participates. And maybe those who are more successful than us, struggling so much to find the new audiences, maybe we can look for a different word, and I wonder which suggestions you would have.
All right. If we can respond very briefly, any final thoughts to either of their questions? Okay, or in the lobby. Only big response.
They're so good. They're such good questions. I just don't think I could do them justice by responding quickly, other than to say that I totally agree. There's got to be a new way to think about it. You know, I think about it with opera, that audience implies you're only listening, to your point. And we're not only listening, we're engaging with our whole body. So trying to figure out that language is something I've been thinking about a lot myself. So thank you for bringing it up.
We'll find you. They'll share your thoughts. I just want to thank our generous and brilliant panel. And to what Deeksha said about what the bigger win is, I feel it ties directly into what Mark Bamuthi Joseph said at the beginning, provocation. You know, in audiences, belonging, community, loyalty through experiences, I think is what we should all be striving for. Thank you very much.